Hello, and thank you for tuning in. I'm the GDDM, and today we're going to be talking about bare bone world building. The way I see it, there's usually two reasons for needing to quickly throw up some boards and hope no one notices that there's nothing holding up the walls. Either you procrastinate on writing something, which honestly I do a lot of, or you want to get a game going quick and may not have that amount of time to polish like you may want to. So today's episode is all about providing some tools and the right questions to ask for piecing together a world quick and on the fly in a way that doesn't seem like it. First things first, when world building, there's a trap that people fall into, and that's getting lost in their own sauce. I do it all the time with my own setting. I'll start by writing something about why the old guard was attacking an escarpment town on the border, and quickly devolve into the trade agreements between dwarves and humans for produce. Trying not to run into tangents in making the world believable is difficult for some, especially myself. This world matters to me, and as such, each part should have some reason for being the way that it is, the way I see it. Is any of it relevant to my games? I would probably say about 20% of what I write about for my games ever become important during an actual game session. So that's why I find it important to try and stick to the bare essentials before getting in too deep. The first thing I recommend when doing world building for a story you have in mind is explicitly writing down the main points of the story. This should be easy to do since it's kind of what we're going to be doing for most of the session. For instance, I was running a game where this bog witch had been stealing locals to transfer their essence into these voodoo dolls just to help her around the house. It was important to think about some of the basic ideas of what the party may want to do or see. I knew that I wanted to set up a cleric to seed a future storyline. There needed to be some kind of official for them to talk to about the weird goings-ons, and there needed to be a town for them to ask questions in. Some NPCs that I don't think are super relevant, but as we all know, players love to talk to. So, at its core, I've set up a few cardboard cutout NPCs in a town for them to walk around in. I like to have NPC cards for these kinds of games that I might not be 100% confident in how they will act. I even use two kinds of cards. The general populist cards, so I know what the average person thinks about the current goings-on, and when meeting some adventurers. Depending on the region, the common person may have a different opinion on what an adventurer actually is, and having some of these notes handy is very helpful for that. I also have a few ideas of personality quirks sprinkled in there. Then for characters I have a better idea for, I'll be sure to have a more specifically designed character card for them with actual traits. For instance, the cleric is clumsy but very informative. He comes off as a shady cult-like character, but he genuinely believes in what he says and he wants to help others. This will give me at a glance an idea of how to bring these NPCs to life for the party. Geez, I'll never understand the obsession with any random character in the path of the party. Why do they want to talk to everyone? I just don't get it. The only caveat to this is when the players might move away from this prop house of a setting that you'll need to be ready for a few more things. This is where, if you saw my video on railroading, this will come in handy. Have a few canned stories or events ready for when the party goes off track. Think of this as a random event table, similar to the random encounter tables in various RPG books. You can look at the monster manuals, the dungeon master guides, or some of the adventure path books from whatever setting it is that you're working with. I tend to put together a list of 5 to 10 things that could happen in a town or along the way to and fro the adventure. This gives me the flexibility to add in things to fill in the space between the more important bulletin points of our story. Now, a wonderful source of quick world building is actually our players. This can vary depending on how much your group wants to provide information about their characters. I've had groups where my players wouldn't give me anything. I would basically get their race and their class, and that's about it. Sometimes you will need to poke and prod them a little bit to get this information, but if they want to write you something, by all means, take a look at it and see how much you can incorporate into your setting. One thing that is particularly important is where you can take shortcuts. For instance, if for some reason there's no one that worships a deity in your group, don't feel pressured to put much thought into it. No shaman or druid-like characters, don't stress about the nature spirits or how they're going to interact with the world. Again, think about what is actually important to the players and get that down first. Simple sentences that describe them will be helpful. As an example, let's look at a character we had in a short game I ran just a couple weeks ago. There was a elf dragon blood sorcerer in Honodoro, an eastern analog country that is primarily governed by evil spirits. From a clan of matriarchal elves. Now, ignoring that there's this stigma with elves in my setting, given their patron god abandoned them, let's see what we can actually grab from the short description that my player gave me of their character. For one, he's an elf, so we can take into consideration how locals might react to seeing an elf if they are uncommon in your particular world. This is good as it starts us to think of if any other race in our game would seem out of place in our story. It might even give us ideas of how to rationalize why they are in the odd land rather than just, I wanted to play an elf tonight. A fair statement, but you get my point, I'm sure. He's also a sorcerer, specifically a dragon-blooded one. So right there, we know our world needs to either have dragons or a reason they aren't around anymore. Is there some class of people that used to hunt these creatures and now don't because they finally succeeded in their quest? What would these warriors be doing now if they're in their free time now that they essentially don't have a purpose anymore? Shout out to demon hunters in World of Warcraft. Great for that one expansion, and now they don't have a purpose anymore. Finally, he's from a clan, a family with ties to potentially other families. This means that there are other clans in the world, and we can create some of these based off of what little we already have. We can also dig into what it means for this particular setting to have families. It encourages us to consider how people would interact with each other, knowing that there's this sort of family caste system that's above the sort of no-named or no-family members of a particular town or whatnot. Does a name carry so much more weight that it matters more than most anything else? Hopefully this is starting to make some sense. We can use just a few words that a player provides about their character as sort of a stepping stone of what we can write about. Inspiration is everywhere, but keeping the most relevant information is very important when considering bare-bone world building. Next up, we have something that I found myself doing quite often, and that's just simply winging it. It's hard to come up with every individual piece of information that you might need in a session. As such, I recommend being very familiar with the feel of your story or setting so that you can improvise something within a reasonable time frame while sitting at the table. You can't let the players smell that you might not be in control. They will smell it and run with it. So I wanted to give an example of something that I needed to come up with on the fly that my players latched onto, and I needed to sort of wrap them back around to the main story. And that's where I will use the Shondis example. See, in our game, our players were investigating some odd goings-on in the town of Yisdale. This is actually the town where the cleric, earlier in the video, the story led to. He was a member of this church, and they're a church that had gone away from traditional deity-type worship. And in fact, they had a whole lot more of a alchemical sway to what they were doing. Now, in the town, I would describe people in taverns whenever they were visiting, trying to add just a little bit of spice. And of course, you mentioned that one person looks a little bit too weird to just be sitting in the bar, and my players would walk over and they would talk to them. Enter Shondis. Shondis is described as being a person that looks like they are out of their way. They look to be like they aren't really supposed to be in this particular part of the country. And really, I didn't mean much about it. it was actually supposed to be in reference to the part that there was a plague happening in my story. It was known as the Red Whispers, and it was actually part of the whole overarching campaign idea was that people were having to sort of evacuate the north and other areas due to this plague that was sweeping through, and Yisdale was able to provide some sort of shelter for these refugees. Now, Shondis, I probably mistakenly described more as a native to the Palud Betadenta, and my players latched on to him pretty quickly. So I had to come up with something that was important for this character to some extent, right? I mean, when a player latches onto something, I think it's important to give them something, because it will accomplish two things in my eyes. One, it will make them feel like they're not just randomly bumping into story plot, and it will make them feel like them looking into things is actually important, rather than just, me moving the slides of the screen across and they get carried along by the edge of the screen. Like, that's not very fun, at least in my games. Most of my narrative that isn't necessary to the main plot, I make sure where the players are going has at least some sort of relevance to the actual story, or at least as exciting is what I'm saying. So Shondis was described as sort of a nobleman after they got to know him. He was a nobleman that was trying to run away from some of the trade princes in New Cold Light. And that's kind of like as much as I gave them at first, hoping that they would sort of like, oh, okay, cool. And of course, they kind of like latched on to him a bit more, so I had to keep coming up with stuff. Well, I know that I had told them about the Lord of the Land, Lord Hendrickson, and they knew that he was like referred to as this Duke of Downpour because he's like this prick kid that took over the throne after 15 different people died ahead of him to claim the rulership over the Betadenta. And so he became the ruler of this land a couple years ago, kind of by accident. And he hasn't really been doing a great job at it. Shondis was this character to kind of fluff up what was going on in the rest of my setting. Because, like I said, only about 20% of whatever I write actually even becomes relevant in my games. And I spend time to write it. My world is important to me, so I wanted to share it to them. And this is probably my favorite part of the Shondis character. It's kind of like seeing a newspaper article for a town a couple towns over, right? This isn't super relevant to what we're doing right now, but it could be, and it's sort of interesting to see what other things are happening. You don't have to read the article, but it's there for the party members that actually want to. And they did. They did hang out with Shondis for a little while. They ended up getting a ring off of him by protecting him from some would-be bounty hunters trying to come and collect him. And I thought that after they started talking with Shondis and they helped protect him, that they were going to sort of steer into the direction of him. And I was a little worried because I hadn't had too much prepared for that. But they ended up not. And that's kind of the other point of the Shondis character, is that you don't put enough bait on the hook to steer them away from the plate of meat that is the main story, if that makes sense. The main story should be obviously what they want to do the most, and then these side hooks should seem interesting enough for them to listen. Specifically, like NPCs should be interesting enough for them to want to listen, but it's not really what the main reason we're here for. So finally, let's wrap up what we should ask ourselves to make sure we're covering some of the bare bones in world building. Number 1, try not to get overwhelmed with figuring out all the tiny details. Number 2, interesting NPCs are perfect to shine a bright light that will cover up other aspects that might be lacking for now. And that's the important part. For now, they're lacking. They will become better, but right now, we just didn't have enough time to get it all together. Number 3, use your players as the ghostwriters for your game. Take their backstories and use as much of it as possible. Number 4, wing it. Know what you're aiming for, and just go for it. Use the Shondis example. Thanks again for taking the time to watch the whole video. I greatly appreciate it. And yeah, the New Year's had me a bit more swamped than I normally would have liked to. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I made some commitments that I needed to take care of, and this channel is like really important to me. It's not only like my main hobby right now outside of actually role playing, but I really wanted to share my opinions on things like this. I like I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I've been playing role playing games for a very, very long time, and I absolutely love it. And whether or not people actually are enjoying these videos, it means a lot to me that anyone is watching it and anyone is getting anything from this. And if you learn anything from my videos, please let me know. I absolutely love sharing about this. Tell me your stories. I really want to hear them. I'm actually putting together some things so that my schedule doesn't interrupt our regular shows for the foreseeable future. So hopefully that comes together this next couple weeks, so I don't have to worry so much about that. This week, I also wanted to give a shout out to the artists that helped me with my excellent outfits here. You can find them on Instagram as Hey Flower Boy. They do great work, and I highly recommend giving them a follow. And finally, before you leave, why not subscribe? You can catch the next week's video. You'll see it on your feed as it comes up. And stay tuned, listeners.